So welcome everyone. I appreciate now it's 5 o'clock. We're all waiting for the free bar to open. So with that in mind, I'll probably try not to talk too much about electrons and biostimulants and things. We'll try and keep this a little bit more lighthearted. It's towards the end of the day, so we'll make a bit of a start. So as a bit of an introduction, I'm Andrew Culbert. I work for ProPitch. I was meant to be joined today by Dean Tingley. He's not arrived yet. He's taken the day off. And also Keith McPherson, who's decided to sit here and listen to me rather than help me out. But the three of us will be here tonight, so if anybody's got any questions, feel free to come and speak to us later on in the evening. So if you don't know who we are already, we are ProPitch. You may well know us from sort of a few years ago. We do a lot of data collection, but there's also a lot of other things that we do within the industry. So we are a consultancy team. We have global experience. We work with a lot of governing bodies, so UEFA. We've done recent work with World Rugby for the Women's Rugby World Cup and other governing bodies. We are also sort of specialists within tournament delivery. We've worked on a lot of tournaments now recently. Even with the last couple of years, we've done the men's Euros, the women's Euros, the Women's Rugby World Cup. We have done a lot of work with CAF as well for the AFCON and for Chan in Africa. So we're well experienced now in tournament delivery. And as I mentioned, you may well know that we've got a lot of experience in pitch data collection and a lot of our own collecting tools and equipment that we design ourselves. But a bit of an introduction to today. What I'm going to sort of speak about is a little bit about returfing and turf installments, something that probably in the UK isn't done very often, unless it's maybe a hybrid turf going in, but it's sort of carried out very frequently on mainland Europe. But again, it's maybe more so coming forward because of concerts and events. There's a lot more stadiums and football clubs that are now looking at returfing their pitches for different reasons. So some of those reasons, it may be an emergency pitch replacement. We may have disease. We're looking at grey leaf spot now during the summer. We've got short grow-in periods as well, again, because of concerts. That's reducing the time that we have to grow pitches in. Again, if we're looking at different grass species as well, you might want to transition species, whether that's Bermuda grass and warm season grasses, whether that's cool season grasses. We also know that grass species like Probotensis take a lot longer to grow in. So if we want to have that within our pitch, we're going to have to either turf that or else we're going to have a very long grow-in period. So again, the reason that we might have a turf replacement is for that species transition and to have that desired species. And again, ease of use. For some of the guys, it's just a much easier process. It's something that they're used to. It's something that's sort of ingrained in their maintenance plan. That's what they do. That's sort of their plan every year, and that's what they go with, and they don't change anything. You can see just the picture on the right here was the recent Eurovision, which was in Basel. So again, that relates to the stadium a little bit. So some considerations to make, when you are returfing. Of course, number one, biggest consideration probably is grass species. Are you cool season? Are you warm season? Are you transitioning throughout the year? Again, we're looking at disease now, and there's certain grass species are maybe more tolerant to certain diseases. So grass species selection is very important. We also look at the location of the turf farm and the travel distance. We know if turf rolls are sitting in lorries for a long period of time, that can cause damage. So a big consideration to make is, where is that turf coming from? Is it local, or how far is it going to travel? Is there any kind of specifics when you're crossing borders? These are all things that have to be taken into consideration. Another important consideration is the growing material. If you're building a 100% sand root zone, what you don't want to do is then top that with a turf that has a lot of clay material or maybe a lot of organic matter. So again, it's trying to match the existing material that you have within your profile to the turf that's going to be imported. That also relates to the turf maturity and the age. Again, considering that some turf farms, the turf may be in there for a long period of time. It's growing maybe 12 months, 18 months. Again, if you're looking at certain grass species like Probotensis, it'll be in there much longer than that at times. So again, if you are purchasing turf, if you're importing turf, that's one thing to think about, is the maturity and the age of that pitch. Again, overall turf quality is something that should be inspected before you harvest the turf and before you import that turf into your stadium, you want to know that the existing quality is of good quality before you bring that into the stadium. And then another consideration is the thickness of rules and the width of the rules. We know that there's certain companies will do wider rules. There's also different thickness of rules. The thicker the rule and the wider the rule means that the turf is much heavier. If it's much heavier, then it can likely be played on, much more quicker after being installed, and will have much better playability. So for us at ProPitch, what we've been doing a lot over the last sort of 12 to 18 months is a lot of installs of turf pitches, and for us that creates a bit of a process. So it's not always just putting the turf into the stadium. There's a process behind that, and it's months in advance that people start thinking about what turf am I going to have, to go through all those considerations that we spoke about. So step one, ourselves, what we would do as ProPitch, if we're employed by a client, we would go to site to the turf farm. Now that might be multiple turf farms, up to 3 turf farms, and we would assess the initial quality of the turf. That allows us to get a better understanding of different aspects of whether it's the grass species, the turf quality, thickness of the rules, the growing material. We can then report back to the client with that information for them to make a decision. Step 2 would then be a presence on site for the harvest. Again, the harvest is a very important time and an important aspect of the install. We need to make sure that the harvest is done under the right conditions. We know that if the turf's harvested whenever it's wet, it can impact the overall quality of the turf. And again, making sure that if you've selected a certain plot within a turf farm that we know is better quality, something as simple as making sure that the turf that's being harvested is coming from that plot that you've paid for. So again, for us, that's a very important process, is being on site for the harvest, the logistics of that, and making sure that turf quality is met. Moving on from that, we would then have a presence in the stadium for the install. So again, all these turf trucks are coming in. We've spoke about the distance they're coming. We need to make sure that when they arrive to site, all the logistics are ready to go, that the trucks aren't sitting outside for a long period of time, because that can damage the turf. Again, when the turf comes off these lorries and starts to be rolled, we need to inspect the quality to make sure that the quality is, number one, as expected, but number two, to make sure there's been no problems, as things have been transported. So moving on from that, we also need to look at things like moisture within the rules. So we will measure every rule that comes down. We measure the moisture, we measure the firmness, we measure the NDVI to make sure that that quality is being met. Therefore, we can have any conversations with the client and with the provider of the turf to make sure that all that turf is as expected. And if there's any rules there that aren't as expected, they can be rejected and then new turf can come in. So essentially that means that we are getting what we pay for. That would then lead us into step 4, at which point, weeks after the install, we would come back, we would do another assessment, we would make sure that the grow-in of the pitch and the turf has went well, we would make sure that everything is as planned and carry out final performance testing to prove to the client, but also to the manufacturer, that everything is as it should be and that the playability of the pitch is there. Sometimes when you have a team, they'll arrive and they will see the joins of the turf in a newly laid pitch, they will have hesitations around the playability of that. So it's important to have the data and the figures there to prove that yes, you may still be able to see small joins of turf, and yes, the presentation of the pitch may not be the best, but actually the playing quality and surface hardness, for example, is all in the correct parameters, and that the pitch is safe. So on the left here, you can see this is some of the data that we would go to site. So if we're at a turf farm, we carry out our assessment. We would look at things like traction, moisture, NDVI, we look at organic matter, the root depth, we look at the material that's there already, and we will provide that report to the client. So that's very important to see exactly what you're getting from the farm. But then also, once the pitch is installed, on the right hand side here, you can see that we would carry out data collection in over 50 locations across the pitch once the turf is installed. And again, that's for us to prove to the client that this is a turf that they are getting, this is the quality of it, and if there's any particular areas that need enhanced work, then we can pinpoint that. So I think we've touched on it before, but organic matter, it's something that we really have to look out for in natural turf, particularly in turf installs. Naturally, a turf that's coming from a farm will have more organic matter, because in order for it to be harvested and to stay together, it has to have some element of thatch, but also be held together with that organic matter. So that's something to consider whenever you're purchasing turf. bearing that in mind that then your maintenance plan should be tailored to that off the back of that. So the organic matter in thatch, as I say, helps to hold the turf together during the harvest, and imported turf can be over 12 months old. So again, that's considering that in a turf farm, they're cutting the turf on a regular basis, but they're not always removing every clipping the way that you would in a stadium environment. So it's understanding that if that turf is 12 or 18 months old, there is a natural buildup of organic matter there that has to be controlled within your maintenance plan moving forward. So that's why it's really important to implement an adequate sort of organic matter removal scheme, or regular verticutting, regular raking. This is also even more important when you're carrying out hybrid stitching. If you imagine you're importing this turf potentially with organic matter in there, once you stitch that, it's then very hard to remove that at a certain depth, because of course you can't run the car over it straight away. So before any stitching is carried out of a pitch that's just been turfed, it's very important to carry out that organic matter removal. So going through some case studies from 2025, we'll go through some of the pitches that we have dealt with over the last year and some of the turf installs. So this one's quite poignant for Switzerland, the Women's Euro in Switzerland here. It was held back in July. So there were several pitches that were turfed in the lead up to the tournament. So the two most notable would have been in Bern and Thun. The reason that these are so special is because only 3 or 4 months ago, these pitches were actually artificial turf, at which point we had to build a natural turf pitch on top of the artificial. So as you can see in the top right here, the photograph, that's the turf being laid in Bern at Young Boys, and also in Thun on the left-hand side. So what's the plan here was we kept the original artificial turf in situ. There was then additional rubber crumb was added to the artificial pitch to ensure all of the artificial fibres stood upright to preserve their integrity. We then laid a geotextile over the top of that, which allowed us to then build up 20 centimetres of sand and root zone material before implementing the turf on top of that. So essentially what we had was 20 centimetres of sand and a natural pitch on top of the artificial pitch. It's something that hasn't really been done too many times before. Because of that, nobody really knew what the outcome was going to be, but actually it performed very well. There was very positive comments. There was no comments from any of the teams as to the pitch. Nobody from the outside world knew that this pitch was actually artificial underneath. But some of the limitations of that is because they had an artificial pitch and we only built up 20 centimetres, what we didn't have was a suitable irrigation system. We had to use the existing irrigation system from the artificial pitch. So if anybody's familiar with that, you essentially have 7 very large cannons around the outside of the pitch. And the biggest limitation here was getting an even coverage of water. So because the cannons are so large, they put out a very large volume of water. So there was areas that were getting a lot of moisture, and then there was other areas that got very little moisture. And during a very hot summer in Switzerland here, it was very difficult to manage that moisture. There was areas of the pitch that were drying out much quicker than others. And as you can imagine, in a pitch that's just been laid with turf, the moisture management is very important. So the team had to work very hard with hand watering and manage the moisture to make sure that everything went to plan. So you can see here, that's the Stadion Wankdorf from the bottom. That was, I think, for the last game. So you can see the pitch quality there. Nobody would know that there was an artificial pitch underneath there. So we had, as I say, that 20 centimetres of sand and natural turf on top of that. And again, this is natural turf. This isn't hybrid. I think everybody in this day and age, the expectation now is to have hybrid pitches. But for this tournament, there wasn't a single hybrid pitch, which was very similar for the men's Euros in Germany the year before. I think out of the 10 stadiums, maybe only 2 of them were hybrid. So again, the expectation is always hybrid pitches are best, but actually at these tournaments, quite often, very few of these pitches are hybrid. Another project we had was in the top left, was in Zurich. Now again, this one was already an existing natural pitch, so it didn't have artificial underneath. However, we had a concert here just 2 weeks or 2 or 3 weeks before the tournament took place. So we had to re-turf the pitch after the concert and very quickly grow that in. And I believe that pitch was then taken up again because they had another concert. So that's something that's becoming a lot more sort of prominent in this day and age, is concerts and events and that's why that returfing now is much more common. But I think maybe 5 or 10 years ago, the expectations were much lower. But now, with the expectations of hybrid pitches and the expectations of very top quality pitches, we have to be more aware of when we do lay a natural turf pitch. That doesn't mean that you've got a perfect pitch straight away. There's still a lot of work to be done on that pitch. So another project that we were involved in this year was the Premier League Summer Series in the USA. So maybe one that people aren't quite so familiar with, but there was 4 teams who were competing out in the USA across 3 cities, so New Jersey, Chicago, and Atlanta. A couple of these stadiums were also used for the Club World Cup. So straight after the Club World Cup, everything got taken out, and then there was more pitches coming in. So if we start in New Jersey, what we had was actually an aluminium flooring. So they have an artificial pitch. On top of that, they put the aluminium flooring for the concert, and then the natural turf went directly on top of the aluminium flooring. So my first thought when I heard about this was, this is never going to work. There's no way this will work. But actually, it turned out, it was safe, it was playable. The overall aesthetics, we admit, are not the best, but that's only because the turf is laid 4 days before on this concert flooring, and then played on 4 days later. The biggest challenge here is that because you have that aluminium flooring underneath, again, you have no irrigation. So I think it was around 36, 37 degrees with turf that's just been laid on top of a metal flooring that's absorbing all the heat with no irrigation system. Trying to keep that pitch cool, trying to keep the moisture in that pitch was very challenging, particularly because there was also no drainage. As soon as the water would drain through the turf, it would then fill back up again from the metal flooring. So as much as we wanted to keep the pitch moist, we didn't want water sitting in it all the time. So again, managing that moisture was very difficult. Moving into Chicago, this pitch was already in situ. However, they also had a concert, so there's a partial returf on this pitch. I believe I might have a photo of that. So yeah, so Chicago is the pitch on the left of the 3. And the picture in the middle is Chicago. So what we had to do here was returf a partial piece of this stadium pitch because they had a concert. So again, you're coming into a stadium where Premier League teams are coming here. They're used to Premier League standards. They're used to hybrid pitches. They turn up to a pitch that visually looks different because a quarter of the pitch has different turf to the rest of the pitch. So again, our job here is to ensure that the quality of the install is where it should be, and to ensure that first and foremost the pitch is safe and playable. And then moving on to Atlanta, which is a very impressive stadium, which is the photo on the right. Here we have a very hot city in Atlanta, Georgia. However, inside the stadium, which has a closed roof, I was wearing a jumper, I was wearing trousers, it was freezing inside. It was about 16, 17 degrees, whereas outside was again 36, 37 degrees. We actually imported Bermuda warm season grass into the stadium, which causes some challenges because you're putting a warm season grass into a stadium that's 16, 17 degrees. Even if you had ryegrass in there, it still wouldn't really like what you're doing because you've also got no light. So you had warm season grass with no temperature, with no light because the roof's closed. But the reason we had to have warm season grass is because where we were situated in Atlanta, in order to transport a cool season grass, you'd be driving over 36 hours. And again, this turf is being laid on top of concert flooring and then being played on 4 days later. So even if we were to import a cool season turf, whether it be Propatensis or Lolium, you'd be taking this over 3 days drive, at which point the rules within the lorries would be degrading, pitch quality and turf quality would be poor, at which point you'd rule the turf out, there'd be yellow dots everywhere, and it wouldn't be very presentable. So we had to make the choice of going with warm season grass within this cold steam environment. I think we cut the pitch once in the 4 days. We ruled it every single day, but we actually only cut it once because there was just no growth. That's how much the Bermuda just didn't like that cold environment in that stadium. But again, it's some of the challenges that you don't always see in TV when you just see the pitch. Whenever you turn the game on to watch, nobody understands some of those challenges that are going on in the background. I think in the middle of the photo as well, you can see some of the irrigation units that we had to use. Those are the ones in New Jersey. So again, these are just pushed out onto the field. So not only are they very labour intensive, but the general coverage of these are quite poor. So moisture management is very difficult. So I do have a video. This is from Atlanta. Not the best video, I'll admit. I didn't think I'd ever use it, but it kind of shows here where we have the artificial turf, and then on top of the artificial turf we have the concert flooring, a geotextile, and then the natural turf. And hopefully this should play. So as you can see, you have the concert flooring, the geotextile, and then the natural turf is literally just placed on top of this within that stadium that has a roof and air conditioning. Again, my initial thought was this wasn't going to work, but it played very well. And the strange thing is where you have the concert flooring, so if we were measuring the firmness and the energy restitution, what we would find is as the player was stepping on the pitch, there would be good shock absorption because the concert flooring would be absorbing all of that impact. But then the natural sort of trampoline effect of that concert flooring was pushing the player back. So actually it was falling within the desired parameters that FIFA would set for energy restitution and shock absorption. That's something that sometimes hybrid pitches can struggle to do. Hybrid pitches, stitched into 100% sand, can become very firm, at which point shock absorption and energy restitution can actually fall outside of the desired parameters. So because of that, I was pleasantly surprised that this pitch actually performed very well. Another project that we worked on this year was the UEFA Super Cup. So again, a similar situation. That this pitch was, I think, almost, Darren can tell me, maybe almost 2 or 3 years without a full renovation. It was in dire need of a full renovation, but there was different stitching depths and different things going on. So essentially what we had done here was we removed all the surface. The turf was then imported close by from Italy. Turf was installed, and then it was stitched with the Verdi mix from Lamonta. So again, this is something that's becoming a lot more common now. I think if you would think about turfing and hybrid pitches in the last 5 years, it was most commonly hybrid carpets because they were more cost effective. But actually now it's becoming more cost effective at times to install natural turf and then stitch, particularly at a more shallow depth, because stitching machines have come on that much now that you can not only stitch at different depths, but you can also have multiple machines, and machines are much quicker. So now you can stitch a pitch within 5 to 7 days with 3 machines on site and install the turf. So actually it becomes more cost effective and more time effective in some ways to install natural turf and then stitch that as opposed to having a hybrid carpet. And one that's a little bit more close to home, just right outside. Again, another project that we spoke about this year was the Women's Euro, and particularly Basel here. I think, again, it goes to show that not everybody sees everything that goes on in all these stadiums. You just turn on the TV, you try and watch Champions League, Europa League qualifiers, and it's very easy for people to comment on pitch quality, but nobody sees what goes on behind the scenes. So here in Basel, they had a pitch that was turfed, I believe, almost 12 months ago. Again, that pitch coming from a turf farm is already a certain age. It's then went through a winter and a season, getting to the end of the season, at which point there was the Eurovision song contest here in Basel, at which point on the pitch here they had a lot of staging because they had the fan zone. So there was a massive cube out in the pitch, there was a lot of weight on the pitch, there was machinery going in and out of the pitch that caused a lot of damage. And this was only, I think, around 4 weeks before the start of the Women's Euro tournament, at which point Basel had the opening ceremony and the opening game. So here we had a partial returf. So what we had to do, and what the team done here, was remove the damaged areas and replace this with natural turf, as well as renovating other areas of the pitch where there was damage and overseeding with lolium. So here what we ended up with is 2 grass species. We had part of the pitch that's being grown in with seed and being renovated, whilst we've got another part of the pitch that's just been returfed with Porpotensis that's visually different. Not only does it have different playing characteristics, but it also visually looks different. And for us, that was a reasonable concern going into a Women's Euro where everybody's going to be watching on TV. We wanted to make sure that pitch was looking at its best, but also playing at its best. Again, using the LED lights to really rejuvenate that pitch and to push things on, But again, this is looking at, not full returfs, but partial returfs and the considerations around that. As we can see, I think this photo was actually taken towards the end of the tournament after multiple games, multiple match day -1 training sessions. Again, something that people don't see is all the training sessions, the opening ceremony rehearsals, the closing ceremony rehearsals, all of that extra usage on the pitch. But you can see maybe I think it was this bay here that originally was different turf. It was Propatensis, but come tournament time, you couldn't even notice the difference between the Propatensis and the Lolium. Another impromptu partial returf was one that nobody expected. This was from the Champions League final. Unfortunately, I was there to witness it, but we had the PSG fans. I'm not sure if it was on TV, if anybody's seen this, but the PSG fans actually invaded the pitch afterwards, where we had a hybrid carpet pitch. They were ripping up pieces of the turf. This was on the Saturday night, at which point Peter in the Allianz Arena had another fixture for the Nations League on the Wednesday. So we had 3 days to repair all of these areas. The third photo there, I'm not sure if you can see, is actually, that's whenever I was getting off the train. I was going back to my hotel, and people had actually taken pieces of the pitch with them and then just left it lying around. So there's multiple pieces. I think there was over 15 of these chunks that were taken out of the pitch. So that was a bit of an impromptu partial returf, but you can see the final photo on the right. That was only 3 days later, at which point the grounds team had everything back into shape again. I think it was good timing in some ways. At Leipzig, we're just having so this was the hybrid carpet pitch, and Leipzig were just having one installed of the same manufacturer at the same time. So Peter was able just to nip up the road to Leipzig a couple of hours and bring back some turf to install. But again, it just goes to show that returfs aren't always planned. Sometimes they come very late notice. So we have another little video here. So just moving on from some of the returfs, we're just looking at more of the data collection side of things. What we have done at ProPitch recently is we have developed a new side of our app. So if anybody's familiar with our app at the moment, it was essentially constructed for us as consultants to use the majority of the time. But we understand that for guys out on the field, for the ground staff, if they're wanting to collect data, they want to do it in an easy way. So we have redeveloped our app somewhat to make it a lot more time efficient and easy for the ground staff to collect data. So I'll just show this quick video. So as I say, we have redeveloped the app to make it much more user-friendly for the ground staff, much more cost-effective. So if you would like to, you can download it at the moment. There is a free assessment on there. So there is a partial piece of the app that's free for grass coverage to allow you guys to have a look at how it works and how user-friendly it is. So the QR code on the left is for Android. And if you've got an Apple or iOS, you can scan the QR code on the right. And that will take you directly to the App Store, at which point you can download that and sign up for free. And then if you have any questions on that, you can, I think you can contact us, Keith. You can contact through the app. Do you want to let them know about the price, or is?
Yeah, I think you can reach out to the app and the pricing structure's on there, but essentially we're looking at like, I think it's £1,000 for the year.
Yeah, I think we have quoted at £999 for the year. As a yearly subscription.
Six pitches.
Yes, and that covers 6 pitches. So that's not just, let's say, your stadium pitch. That's also for training pitches or any other pitches. But essentially what we now can do is we can pinpoint 50 locations across a pitch. So whether you want to go out and clegg the whole pitch over 50 locations or whether you just want to do 2 locations, it's much more flexible. Whereas before, if you would have used it, it would have been sort of set structured assessments that, again, as I say, would have been more for the consultants ourselves to use. But now this is much more user friendly, and you can measure all kind of parameters, whether that's hardness, moisture, traction, whatever sort of equipment you have. Even if you don't have equipment, you can still do grass coverage, which is a visual assessment, and you can log that free of charge. And again, it's a very important tool to use on a regular basis, just to essentially to manage where you are at the start of the season and going through the season. Is there any pinpoints you can start to show? Is there any certain areas that are, if we look at goalkeeper warm-ups, for example, if we can continue to prove that grass coverage in those areas are starting to reduce because the goalkeepers aren't using the warm-up areas or the designated warm-up goals, we can put that to upper management and to the coaches and start to prove a point. But as I say, the QR codes are there, so if you want to scan that, either on the left for Android, on the right for Apple, and that will take you straight to the App Store, and you can download that. And I think that is most of it from us. As I say, it's quite late in the evening now. We're all thinking about the free bar and the food. So if there's any questions, of course, feel free to ask or speak to us this evening. But I don't want to keep you much longer than you have to, because I think we've all got the same idea here. And again, there's just a couple of QR codes there for resources, but what I'll do is I'll just leave those QR codes on the screen, and if anybody does want to scan that, please feel free.